Ladies and gentlemen, welcome in to the Duel of the Greats podcast. Episode 5. Here we are. It's Frankenstein week, or the modern day Prometheus, which actually fits in really well with our topic this week, which we'll get to in just a minute. But before that, introductions, of course. I am Jeff Herr. With me, as always, our local historian, Steve Shepard, and our wonderkind himself, Nate Carter. How are you guys doing today on this lovely evening? It always feels weird on a podcast to say like what the actual time is. How are you doing this evening? Because the beauty of podcasts, anybody can listen anywhere. But it's
Time,
evening for us
anytime.
as we record this.
Playable on demand, I think is what pod stands for.
There you go. Look at
Yeah,
that.
yeah, it's great. It's a
How are you
lovely
guys doing
evening.
on this evening as we record?
Doing well, you?
Always, always. All right. So, what would be Frankenstein week? You might ask. One might ask. And we did ask that question and we answered it. And so the if you've been listening all season, you know, Duel of the Greats podcast, what we're doing here, comparing the filmographies of Steven Spielberg with Ridley Scott. Common themes, certain just common angles that they've taken, or common angles that common points in their careers that have come up, and what they've different paths that they've taken with those certain things. And well, here we are with the idea of playing God, right? Which is what was the genesis of Frankenstein, which is why I decided to call that, or why we decided to call this week Frankenstein week. But more importantly, just how do these two directors who are uh, have a lot of similarities, but also have very very subtle differences that have played out in very large ways in their films. How would they approach and attack something like this, especially given the idea of sort of playing God, of a character stepping in for a godlike figure to in forms of creation. You're someone with Steven Spielberg, who has a history we've talked about, very very long sort of battle that he's had with his own religion, and we've talked about Ridley Scott and his views on religion and everything. So how do those play out in in a movie format of how they really view just God and how he interacts with humanity, right? And it's a really interesting. Um, it's actually quite interesting that they've both sort of taken a stab at this and come out with I think very different approaches. So I think we're gonna dive into that and kind of take a look and see what we think. Which approach we liked better, and the shining examples for these two directors. They actually both kind of have tandem films that work in this regard. So for Steven Spielberg, there is Jurassic Park and The Lost World, of course, right? And we all know, if you can imagine Ian Malcolm, which I'm sure you can, because who can't, right? But talking about he's essentially, saying in the movies, you're trying to play God here. This is wrong. This is what you're doing. Nature selected dinosaurs for extinction. You're bringing them back. This is against nature, and it's something that only a god would have the power to do, and that's what you're trying to insert yourself as, right? And then that kind of snowballs into the Lost World and the how they continue on with the plot from that regard. And then in Ridley Scott, we talked about Alien a few weeks ago, but Alien didn't really tackle that subject, but it's something that Ridley Scott has shown himself to be pretty passionate about, I think, at least from an idea standpoint in his career, and he to the point where he came back and revisited it in 2012 with Prometheus, which was obviously in the Alien universe, and then followed it up a few years later in 2017 with Alien Covenant, where you have Peter Whalen and David the android, and how they and the engineers themselves in those movies, and how they um, sort of how they play God and what that means for the characters who are trying to discover how this happened and why it happened and everything. So um, it was actually kind of I think one of the more fun things about starting this podcast, even before we started recording, just creating these sort of themes and stuff. It was just so interesting to just find out this kind of stuff. Obviously, everyone knows, if you're a fan of either of these directors, that they directed these movies. But try to put it in that context and find that common theme and how much it kind of fits. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I thought that was kind of really fun, and that it's really been, this week especially. I think this is the first week that it'll really be less of that we're going to try to tackle less of the movie versus movie and more of the director's approach in one versus the director's approach in the other for a specific theme. We'll definitely have more of that this season, but this will be kind of the first one where it's just not a direct movie versus movie approach, and finding that they have these movies that tackle this and the similarities and the differences and kind of looking at it. Something that I just, had we not done this podcast, I never would have even thought of in that context. So I just think that's fun. Besides the fact that we're actually going to dive deeply into it. You guys agree? Are you guys in that regard?
I think that we've talked about the similarities with these filmmakers, and like you said, Jeff, it's, I think when we set out to do this, there were certain movies that we wanted to cover. And I think the one that came about of how we wanted to cover it was like, well, we have to talk about Jurassic Park. We
Mhm.
have to talk about Jurassic Park. And then when we started to look at, well, what can we actually put it with? And then when you kind of started to pair these things together and you talk about, like you said, this larger thematic idea, I feel like they fit really, really well this week. Probably as good as they have fit since, probably our Jaws Alien episode was such a good, clean fit with one another. And it's just interesting to see throughout their whole careers as we go through this of how many of their movies and how many of the statements that they make really do kind of fit together like sort of odd puzzle pieces and how it's worked out.
Yeah, because I don't think anybody's going to argue how prominent Spielberg and Scott have been in their careers, but I don't think anyone would group them together like we have and really find similarities, myself included. Had we not done this exercise, I probably wouldn't have thought in that context. But yeah, like you said, it's very interesting that it has worked out so well, or so interestingly in that regard. Steve, would you? Sorry, I didn't mean to sound like you were going to say something. I didn't want to cut you off there.
No, nothing unique to add aside from what you guys were saying. It is kind of a fun opportunity to, instead of just looking at, hey, here are their monster movies and compare them head to head. Like you said, we get to really see what drives the directors. Kind of what makes them tick. Because
Yeah. So
fundamentally, what goes to the heart of things more than the nature of being and why we're here.
absolutely. And to to start off, I mean, we can start with the 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 movies that came first, and that would be in Jurassic Park and The Lost World from Spielberg. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here in regards to, to take this playing God theme. Okay, and like I said, with the Ian Malcolm character, that idea is confronted directly in the movie. But one of the things that is interesting, that unfortunately, it's sad that I have to say this, but as many times as I've seen Jurassic Park and The Lost World, I have never read either book from Michael Crichton. So um, that is something. It is on my list to do, but I have not done it. Now I will. Nate, have you read them?
So I've read both the books, and I will say this is actually something that I had in my notes that I'll just say right now, just to kind of get it out of the way, is that this is an example. And I say this, by the way, as an English teacher. I say this as someone who teaches English. The particularly the first Jurassic Park, the movie, is a very clear example, one of perhaps the most shining examples in all of cinema, at a movie that is just better than the book. It's
Mhm.
just better than the book. It is a greater artistic statement in every way. The only other movies that I think would be in the same realm of how much better they are than their source material is Godfather 1 and 2, which are both kind of loose adaptations of the novel. I just think that First Jurassic, it's. I think if you read the books, you will see that, and this is the case with a lot of Michael Crichton books. We were talking about this just before we started recording. That I kind of went through a Michael Crichton phase when I was like in middle school. He was my first sort of adult author that I read a lot of his
Nice.
books, and he's very technical. He's very sciency, and Spielberg does such a good job of communicating those things to a mass audience, and he cuts out a lot of stuff. The scenes where in Jurassic Park, in the first Jurassic Park, where they're going through, John Hammond has a little cartoon and version of himself that he's interacting with,
Mr.
and they're doing it.
DNA.
Yeah, Mr.
I have a
DNA.
Mr. Steve and I have Mr. DNA Funko Pops.
Yeah, that's like these long sequences in the book where he has this typeface that shows like all these DNA sequences and how they did this, and it's I for whatever reason, I don't know why, I don't recall being bored by it when I was young because I just thought it was so cool. I was reading such an adult book, but again, it's just such a good example of how Spielberg is able to read that and look at that and say, we're gonna do something a little bit different for a mass audience, and then ultimately what he does differently for a mass audience is actually, in my opinion, a much higher artistic achievement than the book is.
Yeah, and it's interesting. The With Spielberg, he's got Jurassic Park, he's got The Lost World, and they were both separate books written by Michael Crichton. And so he's got source material to work off of there. And even though, Alien in that universe wasn't a book, by the time Ridley Scott gets back to revisiting it and putting in these topics in Prometheus and Alien Covenant, you can it's essentially the same thing at that point, right? Because the alien that he created, let's see, that would have been almost 35 years earlier. That had taken on a life of its own now. He had that creation, and it spawned this whole world. Predator somehow gets involved. There's so many different things, so much lore, so much additional story that's been added. It's this whole new world here that it doesn't even quite resemble exactly what he created. And so it's almost like this, he's now working from different source material to create these new stories. So that's kind of interesting when you kind of look at the nucleus behind how both of them came about. But one of the things I was going to bring up with Jurassic Park was, so when I think of playing God, right, in the context of Jurassic Park, I think of John Hammond, and that's where the friction between Ian Malcolm and John Hammond takes place. And so however, again, even though I haven't read the books, my wife has. I've talked to her about it. I'm an avid visitor of the Jurassic Park subreddit, so there's lots of discussion, difference between movie and book there. And one of the big difference everyone always brings up is John Hammond in the books is a out and out capitalist a-hole, does not care about anyone or anything in the pursuit of the almighty dollar type of figure. And so his reasoning for creating Jurassic Park, the actual theme park in the movie, is to make money. And in Spielberg's version, and this is where I think you really start to see how Spielberg is trying to look at this. I think he probably streamlines some of it, is probably, like you said, Nate, for the interest of streamlining it. But I also think there's some that he just doesn't want to have that nakedly awful of a villain there to be that kind of a main character, right? Because that's just not his style necessarily. When he has those characters, those villains, right, they're not Nazis pretty much. So, or just people that are just sort of there to be bad guys. And John Hammond, I don't think he envisioned him that way, and so he changed him to be this sort of benevolent figure. And he cares about, he wanted to bring the dinosaurs to the world, right? He cares about family. He cares about his grandkids so much, and that's again a very Spielberg trait to care. And so that, when you think about what this character was meant to be in the Crichton novel, and then how that translates, I think that really says a lot about how Spielberg looks at God and his relationship to humanity, right? As more of a sort of wholesome look, which is shows through in a lot of his movies, I think, and more of a benevolent creature that is trying to help humanity, to bring stuff to them as opposed to take something away or punish them.
I think that you're absolutely right, and I think that we're really gonna. This is the difference that we're gonna talk about this week. I think it's worth noting the director's personal beliefs. Spielberg is obviously Jewish and has kind of said that he grew up a little bit more culturally Jewish, but came to understand that in kind of a more spiritual sense in terms of his actual religious beliefs as he got older. It seems to me that the difference between these things, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the Alien movies, is that Spielberg believes in something. He believes in something, and he believes that there is some kind of goodness that is dictating humanity and the creatures on this earth. And so there's always this tinge of hope, and that's something that permeates all of his films. Is there's some sort of tinge of hope, even in Schindler's List, which we've talked about. This movie about the one of the worst humanitarian things to have occurred in the last 100 years, really in the last 500 years, or probably on all of recorded human history. He is still able to find this sense of hope in that. And I'm not sure that Ridley Scott feels the same way. And it's interesting to look at. And I'm not, to be clear, I'm not saying one way or the other that one way is right or wrong. Ridley Scott himself has said that he is an atheist, and then has kind of clarified the comments later and said that he doesn't really know. He's probably more agnostic, but it seems like there's that lack of belief. It seems like there is a lack of this goodness and this reach for hope that Spielberg has. And I don't know if that's necessarily dictated by their actual spiritual beliefs, but if you look at these movies and the outcome of these movies, that's kind of what it seems like. It's funny to me that both the Jurassic Park movies always, no matter what, no matter how bad it gets, they all end with some sort of the dinosaurs flourishing on the island, or they're flying away in a helicopter and the little flying dinosaurs. There's always some like final thing of like, see, it was all good. Like, it's cool that there's dinosaurs here. He really reaches for that, and Ridley Scott does not reach for that same kind of imagery at all.
Yeah, so I rewatched Jurassic Park, Prometheus, and Alien Covenant for this. Um, I'd seen The Lost World fairly recently, so didn't bother with that one again. But specifically for the two Ridley Scott movies, I watched the versions with director's commentary, and I've been trying to do that on as many of these films as I can, just try to get a little bit more insight. And Ridley Scott, yeah, you're definitely kind of onto something there as far as what he states his beliefs are. He does, strangely enough, at one point, I think it was on Alien Covenant, he explicitly stated that he believes in superior forces, quote unquote, and the idea of something like a god. So I think he's softened his stance or he's walked it back, but he very much is about processes and the the kind of situations that are necessary for evolution and things to occur. He very clearly, obviously, is a and it literally happens in the movie. We see evolution, so he very much subscribes to that, and he, I think, is very much interested just in the circumstances that are necessary for life to happen, for evolution to occur. And he's not, it doesn't seem to me, based on hearing what he was saying and the result on screen, he's not as concerned with the why. Now, I realize it's kind of a weird thing to say when the whole driving point of the movie is, you know, the people out there searching for life and stuff, but, or the reason for life, and Prometheus specifically. But I think he's much more interested in, yes, these people go out searching for it, but what happens after that? It's ultimately maybe even unknowable, but it's the things that they set in motion during the search. It's all about the process for him, I think, instead of so much the actual, reason.
Yeah, and it's with Ridley Scott specifically, there's so, and I don't know if it's intentional from Spielberg's point of view, but it's almost, you could if you really wanted to sort of twist it, you could almost sort of take it as the, um, there's been a lot of different churches that we've seen the the corruption of the church itself, right? But that's the humanity side of it, right? The actual sort of spiritual side of a church, right? It's spiritual. You can't really corrupt that because it's something that's nebulous. You can't like touch it. But the idea of a church that, you know, there's abuses that have happened within the Catholic Church. There's different churches like Scientology or whatever that have had, different abuses of people involved and money and all that sort of thing. And so, you could almost sort of twist the idea of Jurassic Park into that concept, right? Because you've got the lawyer Gennaro, right? Who he normally you would think of a lawyer in the sense of maybe not necessarily all about profit, but about making sure that, their ass is covered, that they're going to be okay if something bad goes down. But eventually, and that's what that lawyer starts out as, but then once he sees the dinosaurs, then he's like, we're going to make a fortune on this. And they're sitting in there, they're having dinner, and Hammond even sort of takes on that benevolent approach again because the lawyer's like, oh, we're going to make so much money and people will pay that money to come to this park, no matter all around the world. And Hammond's like, no, 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 we're not just catering this to the super rich. Everyone deserves to see these creatures. Everyone deserves. He's bringing this to them. And then Gennaro says, oh, well, we'll have some sort of a coupon day or something to bring it in, and then there's it just you could almost sort of see it that way, the corruption of man versus the benevolence of just wanting to bring this scientific this creation that he's had to everyone who wants to see it, and this goodness that he has in taking that approach for him. And I always thought that was kind of an interesting way of looking at it, whereas you flip over to Ridley Scott's side and he's because even though and again, I don't know if that's intentional on Spielberg's part, but you could at least sort of get yourself there if you really wanted to. But with Ridley Scott, there is a specific religious touch point and just actual confrontation in the film, right? Because Prometheus starts off with Elizabeth Shaw, and David is watching her dreams, which you can, I guess, do in that world, in the when they're in cryosleep, and she's dreaming about her father, who is a religious man, being a missionary, and how important how religion is to her. And she's got, she always wears the cross around her neck, and so there's a much more direct sort of confrontation there. And when you get to the end of Prometheus, right? And because, well, I guess at the very beginning of Prometheus, we essentially have the scene where the engineers are sort of playing God themselves, right? Because the idea is they're creating all of humanity by sacrificing one of their own. And this drinks the black liquid, whatever. And then you get to the end, and they find one of these engineers, and Peter Whalen's huge, his goal that he sacrificed all this stuff, almost his entire company to get, is to play God in a sort of different way. And that's not to create something, but to defy creation, because part of creation is its end, right? Is the death, life into death. But he wants to defy that. And so then he meets this engineer. He's like, tell me the secrets, tell me everything. And the engineer's like, F off, and just rips off David's head and just crushes Peter Whalen. He's dead, and then just runs, and he's going to leave everything, right? And it's this idea that just, if there is, like you said, Steve, from what Ridley Scott said in the commentary, if there are these forces out there, then who's to say they're completely benevolent? Who's to say they even care? Because Elizabeth Shaw during the movie, she comes in sometimes, she's like, why did you want to eliminate us? We did nothing wrong. And what's so interesting, and what part of what I love about Prometheus, is the engineers, to wipe out humanity, they didn't care if you did anything right or wrong. It was an experiment to them, and they just didn't get the result that they wanted, or maybe they did and they just knew the experiment was over and so they were going to kill it. And when you think about a god possibly in that context, it becomes really scary. That what if they just don't care, you know? And that's part of why I loved Prometheus, and that's a very stark difference, I think, when you look at the benevolence of Hammond trying to bring humanity together with this, versus these engineers just not caring at all.
I
Yeah,
think you
it's
really, yeah, I think you really see that dichotomy with the way the directors sort of present the quote unquote monster, and that the alien, the xenomorph, throughout the franchise is like this almost virus, this like parasite creature that you're never like the audience is never like empathetic with it. Okay, it's just this total killing machine. But the dinosaurs, if you look at that throughout the series, you see them often, kind of presented in this very nice light. The end of the first Jurassic Park movie, the T Rex actually kind of
yeah,
becomes the hero
we're
and
rooting for him.
saves the. Yep, you're kind of rooting for him, and he
The
kind of
Jurassic Park
saves.
subreddit commonly refers to her as Rexy.
Okay, Rexy saves the character. It's even funny because, and again, Spielberg was a producer on this. He didn't direct it, but I think it's one of the Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, where it's almost considered like this environmental ecological crisis that these dinosaurs are going to be killed on the side, and people actually try and save the dinosaurs. That's a primary thing that guides the plot of that movie, is that we actually now there's these animal rights activists that believe we should save these dinosaurs. There's nothing like that in Alien. And so I think that dichotomy, what you're talking about, Jeff, is presented so well in just their worldview, and just like what is the conception and creation of these monsters and how are they depicted on screen. And you really see two different versions of that with these directors.
Yeah, Ridley Scott's universe is like you said, it's an experiment that the engineers have put in place, and it's they're interested in the results and documenting it, but they don't really care either way. And in fact, Ridley Scott, when he said about the scene where Wayland confronts the engineer, or was talking to the engineer, trying to get the secrets of the universe, Ridley Scott said that he thinks that the engineer is almost offended, um, that David, this creature that is not a human, that is not something that the engineers themselves created in their image and all this, something like that dared speak to him. So almost like the subjects of the experiment, they've obviously spawned their own creations here, and that isn't, that doesn't even deign rise to the level of something worth listening to because the engineers didn't design it. I thought that was kind of an interesting interpretation, especially considering he's the guy that made the movie.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Because yeah, like your creation's creation, it's
Yeah,
just
it's
a
like a
scoff
pale
at
imitation, right?
yeah, this it's an affront to how glorious your creation was to even try and think you could be on the same level, because that's what's happening, right? You're by creating, you are putting yourself in the role of your own creator. And so those engineers obviously have their own feelings of superiority. And so they're going to be like, who the hell is this guy? Android. Stop talking to me. I don't know. I mean, question how he knew immediately he was an android. Different question for a different time. We're not really discussing possible plot holes, of course, but if you accept the conceit that he knew, then it becomes really a really interesting idea. Especially because then, as we move on to Alien Covenant, David's role becomes that of the intended creator. That's his goal, and we get that was baked in sort of in his programming from Peter Wayland when he was created. We get this sort of opening shot of Alien Covenant where that was back before even Prometheus, where David is serving Wayland and they talk about creation and how it's the greatest thing and all this stuff. So, that's, and then this whole idea of, how is, I'm trying to verbalize this, but like how creation, passing that on is that is that good or bad? You know, because the engineers view that as bad, but then Peter Whalen obviously viewed that as good and wanted David to have that, and then David's out there trying to create this new life form, this xenomorph, which he can't create. He can only reverse engineer, and that's when he realizes he needs actual life to create other life, and that's why you get this sort of this virus approach, like Nate, like you're talking about, and it's yeah, it's really it's a very stark contrast where you get because beyond just this sort of playing God idea, there's in the two universes, like you said, Nate, there's always this sort of hope that comes at the end. Even the movies that he didn't actually direct from the Jurassic Park, and even you talk about the sort of environmental issue in Fallen Kingdom for the Jurassic World. Even in the Lost World, at the very beginning, part of the whole reason for the expedition going to the second site in the first place was because Hammond kind of wanted them to preserve, because he's like, oh, this is amazing. We thought they would die and they're still alive, and this is a miracle, and this needs to be, preserved and all that. Um, and so again, it's him coming back to this, and Malcolm is still like, what are you doing? You're making the same mistake again. This is stupid, and that, but it doesn't matter because he's sort of blinded by this. Even if he thinks he's doing well, he's blinded by his own creation, his own ability to create. And then you actually get that a little bit of that in the first movie, right? When they're in the discussing the flea circus, and Ellie Sattler's like, it's all this control is an illusion. You can't have that control. And Hammond is just like, it's just not computing in his head, and you can tell. And it's really interesting to to see that even when you've sort of sanitized Hammond and given him these best intentions, it's still just it's still never stopping to what Ian Malcolm says in the first one. You never stop to think if you should.
One thing I think both filmmakers kind of agree on is creation itself does not confer control. And to think that that is the case is folly. I mean, that's the whole point of Ian Malcolm's character, right? You can't control this, life finds a way, et cetera, et cetera. And John Hammond, despite all of his good intentions, is painfully learning this lesson over and over again, as it turns out. But and obviously in Ridley Scott's universe, the engineers they wind up succumbing to the creation of their creation. It kind of comes back and bites them. So it's almost about the hubris of even thinking that you have control over something once that the cat's out of the bag, so to speak. It's not just the hubris of Prometheus challenging the gods. It's almost the hubris of the gods themselves to think that they ever actually had any control. And I think they both kind of lean into that a little bit.
Something that there's this great kind of screenwriting moment in Jurassic Park where John Hammond uses this phrase over and over again throughout the movie. He will use the phrase "spared no expense," spared no expense. And one of my favorite little micro moments of any movie is when toward the end the whole thing is falling apart and people are dying and all this stuff. And he's sitting there with Ellie Sattler, and they're having ice cream. They're having kind of this melted ice cream. Um, and she just makes this remark of like she's crying, and she kind of makes this remark of like, it's good, the ice cream is good. And it kind of has this force in on his face a little bit, and it just has this just every ounce of his being, he just goes, spared no expense. And it's this moment of him repeating that line again, Steve, like you're saying, the hubris of like it's finally getting to him of like, I can't buy it. Like my money didn't make it work. And in his instance, obviously it's a very monetary thing, but I can't just buy my way out of this problem like I have done with so much of my life. And that moment of that repeated line of spared no expense is a really, really great screenwriting moment that I always love, and I've learned to kind of recognize as I've gotten older. It's one of my favorite scenes.
I noticed that for the very first time watching this movie this last time. I mean, obviously I'd heard him say that line before in that scene, but just kind of really paying attention to his inflection and viewing everything through the lens of the exercise that we've done here. It finally clicked with me. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that really wasn't just a perfect little moment.
Yeah, that's interesting because go ahead, Steve.
I was going to ask about something else here about Hammond, so I want to hear what you have to think about.
I was just going to say that had never clicked for me until just now, but now that you bring it up, yeah, that's very very astute observation, as we've come to expect.
Well,
from our resident film expert here.
That's why he's here. Speaking of things, both A, clicking, and B, things that maybe you've noticed, maybe you haven't. I can't remember if I read this on an article somewhere, a podcast, or whatever, but once I noticed it, I always obviously see it when I watch Jurassic Park. The symbolism of in the helicopter scene when they're landing, and Dr. Grant can't find the male side of the buckle to plug in to his seatbelt. He only has two female sides, and
so he ties them.
He ties it. Life finds a way, even though just like in the park, it's all females. But look what happened. So I don't know if you guys had ever noticed that, but I thought that's a lovely little bit of symbolism.
I had not, but that's truly that is interesting. That's fun. So that's kind of all I had in terms of just the main points I noticed from the difference in the movies. Or anything else you guys wanted to talk about before we dive into who we thought did it better?
I have one theory that it's been kind of baking, and I want to get your guys' opinion. So we've kind of talked about the differences of them as filmmakers. Whereas, it seems like Ridley Scott kind of a lot of times takes this documentarian approach where, like, we know that he does a ton of work preparing for the shots, and he focuses so much on getting the right actors and getting everything set up, putting like 4 or 5 cameras in there and just letting them go and not giving them too much direction at the time, and basically just documenting what happens. Whereas Steven Spielberg, we know, it's every single shot, it's exactly how he wants it to be. And not to say that Ridley Scott doesn't do that. He storyboards literally the entire movie before he does it. So this theory isn't 100% on point, but I think that there's maybe some sort of something about the way that they're gods. I'm doing finger quotes if anyone could see me. The way that their gods and their universes kind of work. Does that tell us something kind of about how their filmmaking works? In Spielberg's, the Jurassic Park, what we've kind of talked about here, it's, if not a benevolent god, it's not a cold, uncaring, unfeeling thing. That it at least theoretically has some desire to, if not direct the course of lives, but maybe put a finger on the scale of things and kind of guide and shape life moving forward. Whereas Ridley Scott's, it's kind of at best this cold, uncaring, unfeeling universe, and that the gods are hands off completely. They set everything in motion, and now they're just going to sit back and watch. I don't know. Like I said, I haven't fully stuck this in the oven and baked it completely, but I feel like there's something there. What do you guys think?
Sorry, Nate. I was waiting. I thought you were gonna.
I'm thinking that
that's. I've stunned him with.
I'm really thinking. I'm pausing on that. Yeah, Jeff kind of watched me like kind of shaking my head back and forth. No, I think I mean, absolutely. I think there is probably something to that. This is one of those moments where with filmmaking stuff where it's like, these guys are so meticulous that we can, we can go on and on about these theories. Sometimes I feel like I'm always crossing a line of like, and I'm speaking as an English teacher here. Is like, did the writer really intend that? Like,
right.
did the person really intend that interpretation? This is one that I don't know. Like, maybe they did, and if there were 2 filmmakers that I would think, yeah, maybe they did actually intend that interpretation and were not reaching, it would probably be these 2 guys, but I'm not sure.
I don't even know if it was intent, but maybe it's just kind of, they couldn't help but portray quote unquote God, deities, the way that they have, because that's how their brain works. Again, I don't know that it completely holds up, because like I said, Ridley Scott, it's not like he just turns on the camera and says, "All right, go do stuff." You know what I mean? He is very much about planning and everything beforehand. But it's when the cameras actually roll, it's my impression
Yeah,
based
he's
on all
not
the
Kubrick though.
yeah,
Making Jack Nicholson do a take 80 times.
right.
Yeah, so I get what you're saying. Yeah, that's actually interesting. And how much, because I do struggle with that as well, Nate. I remember my English teacher in high school, sophomore year in high school, we were reading Lord of the Flies, right? Every single page, it was like, oh, the parachute symbolizes the freedom of, whatever. And we literally, that was the only time in any of my English classes we literally called our teacher out. We're like, come on, did the artist or did the author really intend this to be interpreted that way? And he was like, I mean, it's pretty clear that so yeah, I do struggle with that line, but I also do think that there is a lot of that, Steve, where a lot of situations where it's just so baked into who they are, right? That they can't help but do things a certain way. You think of Martin Scorsese, right? And he's very open about his issues with Catholicism, and that's his religion and what he's battled with over his life with that, and he confronts a lot of that and a lot of the ideas of toxic masculinity as well, but he confronts a lot of that in his films. But then there's also a lot of the stuff in his films that I don't think is an actual direct confrontation or direct intention from him that still is a part of who he is, that he even himself would have been like, I didn't even realize that this is what I was trying to say when I was saying it. So I'm not saying that's what's happening, but I could definitely see that being the case. And I think with both these filmmakers, they've been doing it so long and they're so ingrained. Even so, in '93, Spielberg had been doing it for over 20 years, and by 2012, shoot, I mean, Ridley Scott had 40 years. So there's you know that there is something there to the idea that they've done it so long and they're so ingrained in, because I do think there's you can get insulated in a world of your own making. You're sort of, people talk about echo chambers and all that. Uh, Not quite at that level, but something similar to that, where you don't even realize sort of how the baseline you've set for yourself because of this you're just always enmeshed in this world. You're always thinking about movies. You're always making movies. One's in pre-production, one's in post-production. You're directing one, and so you're always just at it. You don't have time to sort of separate and think to yourself. I don't know if that's the case, but I do think that that is definitely a big possibility with all artists who dedicate so much of their lives to it.
And it's really interesting you say that because we've talked a lot about. I think everyone would agree the original Jurassic Park is the best and is better than the Lost World. That are the two installments that Steven Spielberg himself directed. He has said,
If you don't believe that, please write in. We would like to speak to you.
yeah, I would love to hear from anyone who doesn't think that. It's interesting because Spielberg himself, kind of to what you're saying, Jeff. Spielberg himself has said that he kind of lost control on the Lost World, where he got so much into his head. He's admitted that he grew kind of disillusioned with the movie while he was making it. It's one of the few times and this is of course many years later, like 10, 15 years later, but kind of grew disillusioned with it and has talked about how the first one, when the original Jurassic Park came out, it was actually the highest grossing movie of all time for a few years until Titanic came out. Like, we're following up the biggest movie ever, and I kind of just got a big head about it, and I wasn't as focused on the characters, and I just thought, if I put the dinosaurs on screen, people are going to love it, and they're going to go see it. You have this whole extended sequence where we get the T-Rex in San Diego, and he kind of admits that he sort of lost control a little bit. Um, so I think kind of to your point that it's interesting to hear a filmmaker um, just not really have the control that he thought that he once had. Um, yeah, here we go. This is a great quote. Steve, did you just drop this in there?
Yeah, I found that
Yeah.
today
My
when I was
se-
preparing.
My sequels aren't, and this is from Spielberg, my sequels aren't as good as my originals because I go onto every sequel I've made and I'm too confident. This movie made a gazillion dollars, which justifies the sequel. So I come in like it's going to be a slam dunk, and I wind up making an inferior movie to the one before. he finishes the last sentences. I'm talking about the last world in Jurassic Park. So there's not a lot of mystery there as to which two movies he's referring to. So yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of what happens, and I think that you know certainly. I'm curious. I don't want to say any more because I want to hear what you guys, which one you think, which director you think did it better overall, and then I'll give my opinion. I think we all agree that Jurassic Park is better than Lost World, but I want to hear which filmmakers you think are which one accomplishes the task better.
Yeah. So do either of you want to start with? Nate obviously doesn't. So
I
Steve, I
think
guess you.
he's deferred to the second
I,
half.
I, I want.
on my
I
side.
think I might want to tie break this one. So yeah, why
Okay.
don't you guys go?
Do you have thoughts, Jeff?
Oh, I have thoughts.
All right, you go first because I honestly I didn't really put them head to head as I was watching it. I was more just kind of trying to figure out who was doing, how they were doing it. But I have thoughts now that I've, he's presented this. But you go ahead.
So I want to get something. So as an Alien fan, before we get into this, just a small aside, if you will. Both of you I know are Alien fans. How do you feel about Prometheus and Alien Covenant in the pantheon of Alien movies? Because me personally, I love Prometheus. I like Alien Covenant fine enough, but I absolutely love Prometheus, and I would even put that as my second favorite Alien movie. So I'm curious because that's a big bone of contention on that Alien subreddit.
It's
I
clearly
calling me an Alien fan is a bit of a stretch. I like the first Alien movie.
get
I'm
off of the
more curious.
podcast. You're out.
Yeah, I'm more curious as to what Steve has to say because I know he's more of the Ridley Scott guy.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I'll defer to him on that one.
Well, not to keep playing ping pong here, but I am curious what Nate, your comments and thoughts are because this is the first time you've seen both of these movies. But I will answer the question. Jeff, I'm with you. I love Prometheus, and I love it more and more every time I see it. Literally every time I see it. It seems like I find something new, and it seems just deeper and especially I guess this time listening to Ridley Scott's commentary, he has been driven. I'm going to earn the explicit tag. He's been driven fucking crazy by who the space jockey is in Alien, the original Alien. When we rewatched Alien a couple weeks ago, I did the director's commentary, and they recorded that in 2004. And at the end of it, he is musing. I think he's in there with some of the actors and producers. He's like, I wonder why no one's ever really considered where the alien or where the space jockey came from. I can't do his accent, but even back then, 20 years ago now, he was really itching to figure out the answer to that. And then he talks about it all the time in the commentary for the two movies we watched today. So I think where's I going with this? Basically, he's obsessed with this question of who the space jockey is. And I think it's fascinating how he played it out. And he clearly cared a lot about it. So it's different than Alien, like the actual movie. Of course, Alien's a horror movie. Prometheus isn't. I mean, it has some horror elements and stuff, but yeah, I'm with you, man. It's probably my second favorite, and I really like Covenant too. I like it even more the more and more I see it, because it's almost a combination of the big questions of Prometheus, but God, the second half of that movie just steps on the gas and goes just like the original Alien. So it amps up the horror too.
Okay, well, I was just curious. So, but to get back to the main point,
hang on. I gotta hear what Nate's opinion is. Well, I guess you can tell us what your opinion is.
Because I thought it was going to be part of his sort of ultimate answer.
We're good.
So for me, I do think that even the reason why I asked that about Prometheus is because I really do like Prometheus. But of these four movies, Jurassic Park, clearly the best. Love me some Jurassic Park, and it's such a fantastic film. So that's out of the way. Because to me, talk about playing God, right? We talk about, like, I called it Frankenstein week. We called it Frankenstein week, and I am a huge fan of Frankenstein book. And the idea of it, of this sort of playing God mythos is kind of it's questions, right? It's questions that don't have easy answers. And I think we've kind of discussed this already in previous weeks that sometimes it's to his detriment because his reach may exceed his grasp. But Ridley Scott is much better at asking questions than Steven Spielberg is, because Spielberg is just not all that concerned with questions. I don't think he's more concerned with the answers and how his characters get to those answers. Whereas Ridley Scott is a little bit different. He's about the characters trying to figure out the questions. And so I love Prometheus. Part of why I love it so much is the Elizabeth Shaw character, and Noomi Rapace just does a fantastic job playing that character, I think. And she, just like the pain in her voice as we near the end, and she's had this C-section, and she's just stapled up, and they put her in this suit, and she's just like, she's screaming at him, why did you want to do this? We did nothing. Just this passion, and you don't get an easy answer, and there is no easy answer to these sorts of questions. And I think Ridley Scott does a good job of presenting that. And I think in these scenarios, for me personally, even though it's not a neatly wrapped up answer, that's okay for this, because I think part of it is just the question of what if, and actually allowing yourself to think to go there, right? Because at the end of Prometheus, it's not all like super bad, right? Like pretty much everybody's dead. Well, everybody except for Elizabeth Shaw is dead. And so that is obviously bad. But for Shaw as the main character herself, she's like, I have a mission now. I have a reason to be. I'm gonna go to the engineer's home planet. I'm gonna find this answer, right? So there's a little bit of hopefulness there. It's not Spielberg level hopefulness, but there's a little bit of it there. But so there is that slight positivity, but the there's a better job of asking these questions and giving these very difficult sort of answers that aren't always clear and non-answers. Whereas you look at Spielberg and you look at the Hammond character, and it's just, he gets confronted, he gets asked these questions by Malcolm, who's just, didn't, the whole speech, life finds a way, that whole speech, right? Hammond just sees that and he's like, oh, okay, that's fun. And off we go. And that's kind of it. And so this sort of sanitized version of Hammond and of a sort of almost benevolent God, it's not as interesting to me. It helps in the context of Jurassic Park to make it a better movie, but in terms of tackling that sort of subject of creation and what it means to do that, and should we do this, is it right or wrong, etc., the ultimate conclusion that I think Spielberg wants to make is that it's wrong, but he still can't fully get himself there, because like you mentioned earlier, Nate, it's still just the dinosaurs are happy and this is a beautiful thing, and they're going to be okay, and everyone's flying off the island and it's going to be okay. And at the end of the Lost World, the baby T-Rex is back with its mommy, and then they pounce on the evil corporate guy and he dies, and it's going to be okay. And it's just, that's not always life, and that's not always the way that these sorts of things play out. And so for me personally, I find Ridley Scott's approach to be more interesting, and I think he has spent so much time thinking about it, like you said, Steve, that it's something that he's been able to distill into a something that is watchable and enjoyable, but also not to the point where I'm just like, it's not free of life, right? Where it's just all this obscure imagery and weirdness, and you're just, what am I supposed to say with this? Like there's some clarity there, but there's still some openness, and I find that to be very interesting and compelling personally. So I give the nod to Ridley Scott in this regard.
Nate, you're entirely useless this episode. You're not needed, because I agree with you. Steven Spielberg, I think, I agree with you. Jurassic Park is my favorite of the 4 films. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. I could watch it over and over again. It's, almost a perfect movie. But as far as the theme goes, I think, like you said, Ridley Scott, he's just painting on a much bigger canvas. he's asking questions that Spielberg's not interested in. I think, um, and maybe not on a personal level, but in terms of making the film, it seems like Spielberg set out to give us a show, and Ridley Scott set out to answer that damn question about space jockey. Like he wanted to do that for himself, no matter what happens. So yeah, I'm with you. I prefer Ridley Scott's approach. I think he wins this duel.
Well, I guess I am completely irrelevant. I will say some of this is going to get into personal preference. I think that there are people. I think if you so I'd never seen Prometheus or Alien Covenant. I watched them for the first time to record this. I think that there are people who are, if you are a big fan of the franchise, you probably loved both of those movies. This is the first time that I'm saying this on this podcast. Steve knows this about me because we kind of grew up together and we've watched a lot of movies together and done this. In a general manner of speaking, and there are many exceptions to this rule, I trend away from horror as a genre. And their particularly Alien Covenant goes a little too horror for me. There's also kind of something that gets affected a little bit with the Prometheus and again particularly Alien Covenant is when you look at the original Alien, the chestburster scene was so shocking because it was so new and so different, and we'd never seen it. By the end of Alien Covenant, the chest bursting the novelty has really worn off. These things are just popping out of human beings left and right all the time, and I kind of feel like that sort of wears off. There's also the scene at the end of Alien Covenant in the shower where I feel like is almost a very kind of standard horror filmish thing that even I'm
I
surprised
love
Ridley
it.
Scott went there. And I know that's what I'm saying. I think if you're a fan of the Alien franchise, you probably love that scene. It just seems like such a cliche thing to do. I agree with both of you. Clearly, the best film of these four is the original Jurassic Park. Honestly, if you're thinking of genre, and I think we would generally call these like science fiction horror. Jurassic Park may be the greatest movie ever made in that genre. Maybe something like Terminator 2 could compete with it a little bit. Maybe something like The Thing could compete with it a little bit. But Jurassic Park is probably no one would have an issue if someone said that that was the greatest science fiction horror movie ever made. So I will lean with Spielberg just because of, but I'm almost kind of glad I'm not winning this week, that I'm not breaking a tie, because my personal preference is really weighing on how I assess these films. I think Prometheus is better than Alien Covenant, and again, I've only watched each of them once now. I liked the questions that were being asked in Prometheus, and I agree with both of you in what you're saying that I do think Ridley Scott, in terms of the question of the week, of who is tackling these bigger questions, I think Ridley Scott is doing that. I think he's doing that in a more profound way. That he's looking at much bigger questions and is really he's not dumbing anything down for its audience. His audience is going to have to go in and ask themselves these kinds of questions. So I personally prefer Jurassic Park. Um, I think Jurassic Park is the best movie of the four, but I think I agree with both of your assessments, and I will gladly concede that Ridley Scott wins this week, and I'm glad I didn't break the tie because I'm acknowledging my own personal preference, not against the horror genre. There are horror movies that I absolutely love, but just in a general manner of speaking, I trend away from that as a personal preference.
And that's completely fair. And I think for me as well, I think a lot of that probably comes to personal preference also, because I just happen to find that the ideas that Ridley Scott explores to be more interesting. Um, because yeah, I mean, there's, like you said, with in that specific genre, if you were to Jurassic Park, I mean, who's going to argue that, right? Try it. Somebody try it, please.
I mean,
But it's
Aliens may be the best candidate to go up against it, but
that's true. That's true.
Be a good question for the socials, honestly, is just to kind of get,
yeah,
science fiction horror. What do we think are the top 5 movies in that? But yeah, I think Jurassic Park is certainly going to be. It's in the top 5.
right.
I mean, we're all in agreement on
Yeah,
that. So.
it's definitely not a wrong answer.
Right.
For sure. So yeah. So what's our tally now? We got 3-2 now. Ridley Scott. Am I right on that one?
Like I always said, Ridley Scott, the best director ever.
So that's interesting. But we've still got quite a few weeks to go. So next week is Cyberpunk Detective Week, folks. We are going to be pitting Steven Spielberg's Minority Report up against Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. So two, um, you know, futuristic detective sci-fi stories, but also, interestingly enough, two movies based on source material written by the same person in Philip K. Dick. So, I believe Minority Report that story was titled Minority Report, but I always loved that Blade Runner was based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Philip K. Dick. There was nobody better at making titles for his short stories than Philip K. Dick. Like Total Recall was a short story was we can remember it for you wholesale. I love that. Like it's just you already know what the story is going to be about, and it sounds harrowing. And anyway, but that's an aside. This is not a Philip K. Dick podcast. Don't confuse. Try not to confuse anybody here.
Not this week. Maybe next week.
Not this week. That's right, but he might factor in next week. So anyway, so yeah, that'll be next week. Minority Report going up against Blade Runner. That's going to be a fun one. So we'll see you next week. Until then, thank you all so much for listening. If you got any comments, if you want to talk to us about why Lost World is better than Jurassic Park, please hit us up. Steve, give them the socials where they can talk to us.
Yeah, we're at I believe it's it's on the show notes. I don't have it pulled up. I think it's Duel of the Greats, at Duel of the Greats for everything except TikTok, and I think it's like Duel Podcast on there.
So yeah,
there we go. Just scroll down, you'll see it. Our producer Brandon, he'll get you squared away.
Indeed. So hit us up with that. And for myself, Steve Shepard, Nate Carter, and of course our fearless producer Brandon Nichols. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you next week.